Have you ever felt trapped by your own words? Perhaps it started with something small, a slight exaggeration on your resume, a convenient excuse to avoid an unwanted invitation, or a partial truth to protect someone's feelings. But then, like a single thread pulled from a garment, that initial departure from truth required another, and another, until your life began to feel like an intricate tapestry of half-truths and omissions. Maybe you've reached the point where you can barely distinguish between what's real and what you've fabricated, where maintaining consistent stories requires mental energy that could be used for more life-giving pursuits. Or perhaps you simply long for the freedom that comes with knowing there's nothing to hide, nothing to manage, nothing to fear being discovered. Today we're going to explore the challenging but liberating path of radical honesty, what Scripture calls living in the light, and discover how making a clean sweep of deception, though initially painful, leads to a peace that superficial living can never provide. But whoever lives by the truth comes into the light, so that it may be seen plainly that what they have done has been done in the sight of God. John 3:21. This verse from Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus reveals something profound about honesty. It's more than just an ethical choice. It's a spiritual orientation. Those who live by the truth are described as coming into the light, not reluctantly or fearfully, but deliberately, even eagerly. They seek exposure rather than concealment, transparency rather than hiddenness. And why? Not to display their moral superiority, but so that it may be seen plainly that what they have done has been done in the sight of God. True honesty flows from the recognition that we live every moment before the gaze of a God who already knows everything about us and loves us anyway. This awareness transforms integrity from a burden of self-effort into a natural expression of living in relationship with the One from whom nothing is hidden. If you have a habit of lying or twisting the truth a little, you need to dismantle the house of cards you've built. This direct challenge acknowledges that dishonesty often becomes habitual, an almost automatic response to discomfort, fear, or the desire to present ourselves in a better light. What begins as occasional deception can gradually become a default setting, a reflexive way of navigating the world. The metaphor of a house of cards is particularly apt. Such structures appear impressive from a distance but lack any solid foundation. They maintain their form only through careful balancing and the absence of disruption. Similarly, a life built on dishonesty may present a convincing facade, but it remains inherently unstable, constantly vulnerable to collapse. The tricky thing about lying is that it rarely stops at one lie. If you make something up, chances are you'll have to make up something else to make the first thing believable. And before you know it, you've woven a web of dishonesty. You become trapped in it and have to keep twisting the truth so your lies won't be discovered. This insightful observation captures the progressive nature of dishonesty, how one deception typically necessitates others, creating an expanding network of falsehood that becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. The metaphor shifts from a house of cards to a web, emphasizing how we become entangled in our deceptions. What began as a seemingly simple solution to an uncomfortable situation becomes a complex prison requiring constant maintenance and vigilance. The mental and emotional energy required to track and protect multiple falsehoods is exhausting, creating a background anxiety that never fully subsides. Ethan discovered this reality after exaggerating his professional qualifications to land a job he desperately wanted. "I added a certification I hadn't quite completed and inflated my role in a previous project," he admitted. "I told myself it was just polishing the resume. Everyone does it." But the initial embellishments required elaboration during the interview, which led to more specific fabrications once he was hired. I found myself avoiding certain colleagues who might expose the gaps in my knowledge. I had to create fake anecdotes about experiences I'd never had. I was constantly worried about being found out, which ironically made it harder to learn what I needed to know to succeed. What Ethan discovered was the oppressive weight of living in dishonesty. What had seemed like harmless resume enhancement became a source of constant stress that affected his performance, relationships, and self-image. I wasn't just lying to my employer, he reflected. I was living a lie, and it was exhausting. I couldn't even enjoy my accomplishments because I was always wondering which parts were genuine and which parts were performance. Ethan's experience illustrates how deception, which often begins as a shortcut to what we want, frequently becomes a detour that leads us further from authentic achievement and connection. Unfortunately, there's no way to gradually dismantle a house of cards, as much as you might want to. When one card falls, they all fall with it. This observation acknowledges the painful reality that undoing patterns of dishonesty rarely happens incrementally or comfortably. While we might prefer a gradual, controlled process of becoming more honest, one that allows us to manage the consequences and maintain our dignity, deception doesn't usually unravel so neatly. Once fundamental untruths are exposed, related fabrications often collapse simultaneously, leading to a period of painful but necessary revelation. This isn't because truth is cruel, but because integrity is holistic. It cannot be compartmentalized or adopted selectively while maintaining its essential character. This reality can make the prospect of honesty seem frightening, even catastrophic. If my whole identity or important relationships are built on deceptions, won't complete honesty destroy everything I've worked for? Won't it hurt people unnecessarily? These concerns are valid, but often overestimate the long-term damage of truth, while underestimating the ongoing damage of dishonesty. Most people discover that while the initial collapse of deception can be painful and disorienting, it also creates the necessary space for building something authentic and sustainable in its place. If you lead a life of dishonesty, your best bet is to make a clean sweep. Your house of lies will then collapse, making things temporarily even more difficult. But the pain of those difficulties leads to freedom. This advice doesn't minimize the challenge of radical honesty, but frames it within a larger narrative of liberation. Making a clean sweep requires courage, the willingness to face consequences, disapproval, and the disorientation that comes when familiar patterns, however unhealthy, are disrupted. But this temporary intensification of difficulty serves a purpose. It clears the space needed for authentic rebuilding. The pain becomes purposeful, not just punitive, because it leads toward the freedom that can only be found in living consistently with reality. Olivia experienced this painful but purposeful process after years of hiding her struggles with alcohol. I had become so skilled at concealing how much I was drinking, she shared. I had secret stashes, elaborate explanations for my behavior, and ways of disguising the smell on my breath. I maintained this perfect image as a successful professional and devoted mother, but inside I was falling apart. When her husband discovered one of her hidden bottles and confronted her, Olivia's initial instinct was to create another layer of deception. I had a whole story ready about how I was just saving it for a special occasion, how he was overreacting, how this was completely out of character for me. But in that moment, something shifted. I suddenly saw the exhaustion on his face and realized he had probably known the truth for a long time. And I was so tired of the hiding, the planning, the constant fear of discovery. So instead of another lie, I just said, "I need help." That simple admission of truth triggered the collapse of Olivia's carefully constructed facade. Everything came crashing down at once. I had to take leave from work to enter treatment. Friends and family learned about my addiction. My children had to adjust to a new understanding of their mother. It was humiliating and terrifying. Yet as painful as this collapse was, Olivia describes it as the beginning of her freedom. Once everything was in the open, I could finally stop expending all that energy on maintaining the lie. That energy became available for actual healing, and the relationships that survived, which were most of them, became deeper because they were finally based on who I was, not who I pretended to be. Olivia's experience illustrates how making a clean sweep, while initially devastating, ultimately creates the conditions for authentic reconstruction and genuine freedom. You can compare it to spring cleaning. It gets messier before it gets better, but that's part of the process. This helpful metaphor normalizes the initial increase in chaos that often accompanies truth-telling. Anyone who has undertaken a thorough cleaning of their home knows this pattern. The process of sorting, discarding, and reorganizing temporarily creates more visible disorder than existed before. Drawers emptied onto tables, closets disgorging their contents onto floors, dust disturbed and made visible. All these make the space appear worse before it improves. Yet this temporary disorder is necessary for genuine renewal. Without it, the cleaning remains superficial, merely rearranging what should be removed or transformed. Similarly, the initial honesty that disrupts patterns of deception often seems to create more problems than it solves. Relationships may become temporarily strained. Legal or financial consequences might need to be addressed. The personal identity built on falsehood must be dismantled before an authentic self can emerge. But recognizing this pattern as normal and necessary, not a sign of failure, but an indication that the process is working as it should, can help sustain courage during the most disorienting phases of truth-telling. Even when things are lying around everywhere and it looks more chaotic than ever, you can relax in the knowledge that it has to get harder before restoration can take place. This insight offers comfort during what is often the most discouraging phase of moving toward honesty. When the consequences of truth-telling are at their most visible and painful, doubt can creep in. Have I made things worse? Would it have been better to leave well enough alone? The temptation to retreat into familiar patterns of deception can be strong at this point. But understanding that this phase of heightened difficulty is not just normal but necessary, that it represents progress rather than regression, can help maintain commitment to the process when it's most challenging. The chaos isn't evidence that honesty was a mistake. It's confirmation that genuine change is underway. Noah discovered the truth of this principle when he finally confronted the financial deception that had entangled his family for years. I had been hiding our debt from my wife, making minimum payments on credit cards she didn't know existed, and presenting a picture of financial stability that was completely false, he admitted. When I finally showed her all the statements and confessed the extent of our situation, it felt like our life exploded. She was understandably angry and betrayed. We had intense arguments. Our plans for the future seemed suddenly impossible. It was so painful that I questioned whether honesty had been the right choice. But as Noah and his wife worked through this crisis, something unexpected emerged. Once we were dealing with our actual financial reality instead of my fictional version of it, we could make real decisions instead of pretend ones. We created a genuine budget based on our true income and expenses. We developed an actual plan for debt reduction rather than my frantic juggling of accounts. And most importantly, we were facing it together instead of me carrying it alone and keeping her in the dark. Like a home amid spring cleaning, Noah's financial life got messier before it got better. But that temporary intensification of chaos was precisely what allowed for authentic restoration to begin. Yes, you'll have to humble yourself, do things to make amends, and face certain consequences, but the reward will be greater than the price you pay. This realistic acknowledgement of the costs involved in truth-telling is balanced by the assurance that they're worthwhile investments rather than mere penalties. Making amends isn't about self-punishment, but about restoration, taking responsibility for repairing, as much as possible, the damage caused by deception. This might involve financial restitution, public apologies, the surrender of positions obtained through dishonesty, or the patient rebuilding of trust in relationships. These actions aren't arbitrary hardships, but necessary components of genuine transformation and healing. Yet even as the passage acknowledges these costs, it emphasizes the disproportionate rewards that follow authentic living. The freedom from constant vigilance, the energy liberated from maintaining falsehoods, the depth of connection possible in relationships based on truth, the quiet confidence that comes from integrity. These benefits far outweigh the temporary pain of consequences and amends. This isn't a prosperity gospel promising material rewards for moral behavior, but a recognition that living in alignment with reality, however challenging initially, ultimately creates the conditions for genuine flourishing. A sincere heart and a clear conscience are like a soft pillow. Embrace that, and you will enter fully into the Lord's rest. This beautiful metaphor captures an often overlooked reality. Dishonesty doesn't just damage our relationships with others. It fundamentally disrupts our relationship with ourselves. The constant internal friction created by living in contradiction to truth affects our ability to rest, not just physically, but psychologically and spiritually. Just as a lumpy, uncomfortable pillow prevents deep sleep, a conscience burdened by deception prevents the soul's deep rest. The promised Lord's rest goes beyond mere relaxation. It suggests a profound peace that comes from living in harmony with our created design and purpose. The rest isn't earned through perfect behavior, but received through authentic living before the God who already knows every detail of our lives and loves us entirely. Layla discovered this connection between honesty and rest after years of presenting a carefully curated version of herself to her religious community. "I grew up believing that acceptance depended on perfect behavior," she explained. "So I developed this carefully constructed persona, always positive, never questioning, hiding my doubts and struggles with depression. I was the model believer on the outside, but inside I was exhausted and increasingly disconnected from God." The disconnect between her public image and private reality created a persistent unease that affected every area of her life. "I couldn't even pray honestly anymore. I would catch myself performing in my prayers, as if God only accepted certain kinds of emotions and thoughts." The turning point came when Layla found a spiritual director who created space for complete honesty. She encouraged me to bring my whole self to God, my anger, my questions, my disappointments, not just the acceptable parts. It was terrifying at first. I thought God would reject me if he saw who I was. But as Layla practiced radical honesty in this safe relationship, something began to shift in her spiritual life. I discovered that God already knew all those parts of me and loved me anyway. The energy I had been using to maintain my perfect image became available for an actual relationship with him and others. The result wasn't just improved relationships, but a profound inner rest that had eluded her for years. There's this deep peace that comes from not having to pretend anymore, with others or with myself or with God. I still have struggles, but I don't have to hide them. That constant background anxiety of being discovered has disappeared. Layla's experience illustrates how truth-telling creates the conditions for genuine rest. Not because it makes life perfect, but because it removes the exhausting burden of maintaining inconsistency between our inner and outer realities. So what practical steps might someone take to begin making a clean sweep of dishonesty? First, start with an honest self-assessment. This isn't about merciless self-condemnation, but about compassionate clarity. Where have patterns of deception become established in your life? Are there specific relationships, contexts, or types of situations where dishonesty has become habitual? Understanding these patterns is essential for addressing them effectively. This self-assessment itself requires courage, the willingness to see clearly what might be painful to acknowledge. Second, consider beginning with a trusted confidant, someone wise, discreet, and compassionate who can provide perspective and support as you move toward greater honesty. This might be a counselor, pastor, sponsor, or mature friend who can help you discern appropriate timing and approaches for addressing different areas of deception. Not every truth needs to be shared with everyone immediately. Wisdom in the process of truth-telling helps ensure that honesty becomes healing rather than merely disruptive. Third, prioritize which areas of dishonesty need addressing first. Sometimes the most significant deceptions should be addressed immediately because they're causing ongoing harm or preventing other progress. Other times, it's wise to begin with smaller issues to build confidence and develop skills for handling more challenging revelations later. There's no universal formula here. Discernment based on your specific circumstances is essential. Fourth, prepare for the consequences of honesty without letting fear of those consequences prevent necessary truth-telling. This might involve consulting with appropriate professionals, legal, financial, therapeutic, to understand potential ramifications and develop response plans. While consequences shouldn't be avoided when they represent appropriate accountability, neither should they be unnecessarily maximized through poorly planned revelations. Fifth, remember that the goal isn't just confessing past dishonesty, but developing new patterns of integrity moving forward. This involves identifying the underlying needs or fears that motivated deception and finding healthier ways to address them. Were you lying to gain approval, to avoid conflict, to maintain an idealized self-image, to protect yourself from vulnerability? Understanding these motivations helps in developing alternative responses that honor both truth and the legitimate needs that drove the dishonesty. Finally, be patient with the process and gracious with yourself when setbacks occur. Patterns of dishonesty often develop over the years and aren't transformed overnight. Momentary returns to familiar patterns of deception don't negate progress already made. They're opportunities to recommit to the journey with greater understanding of the challenges involved. The path to integrity isn't about perfection, but about direction, a consistent movement toward greater alignment between our inner and outer realities. This journey toward radical honesty isn't easy, but it offers a freedom that no amount of skillful deception can provide. Like the thorough spring cleaning that creates short-term mess, but long-term order and beauty, making a clean sweep of dishonesty involves temporary disruption that leads to lasting peace. The house of cards collapses, yes, but in its place can arise something genuine and stable, a life built not on the shifting sands of deception, but on the solid ground of truth. And in that truth, as Jesus promised, we find not judgment, but freedom. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. John 8:32. Let's pray together. Jesus, I want to make a clean sweep. Help me turn my life around and become an honest and integral person. Give me the courage to face the temporary chaos that comes with truth-telling, knowing that it leads to authentic restoration. Show me where deception has become habitual in my life, and grant me wisdom in addressing these areas with appropriate timing and approaches. Surround me with people who will support this journey toward integrity, and help me extend to myself the same grace you so freely offer. As I move toward living more fully in the light, let me experience the rest that comes from alignment with truth, the soft pillow of a clear conscience and a sincere heart. In your name, Amen. As you move through your day, Take time to reflect on these questions. Do you struggle with speaking and walking in the truth? What steps can you take to make a clean sweep? Consider where patterns of small deceptions might have become habitual in your life. Not to condemn yourself, but to identify opportunities for greater freedom through honesty. Remember that the goal isn't perfect behavior, but authentic living, a life characterized not by the absence of mistakes, but by the presence of integrity in how we address them. If this message has resonated with you today, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might be struggling with patterns of dishonesty, and subscribe to our channel for more content that explores practical faith in everyday challenges. Also, be sure to check out our video on finding freedom through forgiveness, where we delve deeper into how accepting God's grace enables us to extend it to ourselves and others in the journey toward wholeness. Remember, the path to integrity isn't about achieving moral perfection, but about embracing the freedom that comes from living authentically in the light of God's perfect love and acceptance.